begin with our opening panel, and that is the Supply Chain Sustainability Forum. My guests, starting on the far side, are Mike Broman, Head of Supply Chain at Community Fibre. We have Maureen O'Shea, Supply Chain and Sustainability Partner at Baringa, and Phil Hallinan, Head of Sourcing and Sustainability at Wyndham Hotels and Resorts. A warm round of applause for all of them, please. Good morning, good morning. That was quite a lot to read out in one go, so we are here. Here we go. So this is the Supply Chain Sustainability Forum. We've got a series of questions we'll work our way through, but I will come to a Q&A from the room towards the end, and I try to leave as much time for those as possible. Anyway, good morning, all of you. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And I'll start with a nice open question before we get into things, really. And that is how businesses can establish and monitor sustainable practices across their supply chains. Because I guess that's the key. You can put anything in place you like. If you can't monitor it, you may as well, it's questionable whether to do it. I'll start with you, Mike. What are the key steps for that in monitoring it?
I think making sure that you've got collaboration across your whole business and making sure that your KPIs match across the whole of the range. So not just looking at the traditional parts, but also moving into sustainability and making sure they work for all of the local areas. So it's not just a UK-based statistic is different from a Far East statistic, different from a Western statistic. It's making sure that collaborates across the whole of the business partners, so you make sure you're working with them locally to make it work.
Maureen?
So Mike and I were actually chatting about this one outside. As long as sustainability is kept apart from the rest of the business measures, you're not going to make progress. It needs to be on the balanced scorecard for each GM. It needs to be part of their bonus structure. It needs to be a measure that you care about as a business. Otherwise, you're not going to drive it forward. So anyone running an international business, you know how to drive cost discipline across the areas. You know how to drive diversity. It's exactly the same. Sustainability is either a real part of your business on the scorecard, or it's a side project and nothing's going to happen.
Phil?
Sure, it's interesting. We haven't spoken about this before, but it's exactly what we do. It's giving the ownership and the responsibility to our regional directors across the patch, and making sure they understand the metric, they understand what it is they need to do. Me and my team are available to help with strategy and tools to actually deliver what they have to do, but it all comes down to that personal accountability. I think the other thing to take into account, especially if your international business across borders is getting some kind of knowledge of what is expected in each of the key geographies in which you operate. So we have hotels across multiple geographies, so 44 countries in EMEA. And each one has a different expectation. Obviously, you have EU taxonomy, things like that. So you need to make sure that it's relevant for the properties that you're working with in our case. But it's that sort of relevance and ownership, I would say.
Well, let's drill into a few of those points in a bit more depth. And the next question I did want to go into is looking at the variations across borders, because I'm sure that's a challenge for people with different policies, different regulations. What advice would you give to people? Let's say it's an operation which is going international. How would you address that?
I would say consistency in measurement is really key. So from a sustainability perspective, one of the things that I'm trying to do through our procurement programs, obviously I've got a foot in both camps, is ensure that the procurement programs have clear sustainability objectives in them, and it's made very obvious to everybody who's involved in that process of implementing a sustainable procurement program why it is they're doing it. If you take a hotel, for example, we've got multiple different stakeholders, from obviously the guests, but also everybody through from housekeeping to department heads to general managers, and then of course asset owners in our franchisee side. And I think it's really key that you explain to everybody why you're doing something. I'm going to take a really kind of obvious one that all hotels use, which is single-use plastic. So we're eliminating that. We have done deals centrally with 2 manufacturers, one in Turkey and one in India, to supply our geographies from there. And convincing franchisees to do something is always difficult, because they might always have somebody, a mate of theirs around the corner, who could do it cheaper. Well, of course they can, but it's not the same quality, it's not the same product. So it's very important to make sure that people understand why you're doing it, what are the drivers, what's the benefit, and then get them to see the whole kind of total cost of it. We're all procurement people in here, these are basics, but that explained properly will, I think, drive engagement. And it will also drive consistent data reporting as well. Every time I do one of these things, and every time I do anything, it's data, data, data. So get consistency and repeatability in that, then you're in the right track.
Yeah. Well, I'll pass that down the line about how you work across those boundaries and those borders.
So I think those are very, very well made points. You touched on regulation. I think anyone who's made the time to come into the room this morning is not trying to stay one step ahead of regulation. We know that that's very much the whip that's bringing the tail along to where everyone else is trying to get to in sustainability. So you're not trying to stay where that is. You're certainly looking forward on regulation, and particularly for any capital investments. If you're putting in place a new supply chain, if you're launching in a new country, if you're building infrastructure, you do need to do sort of a 10-year projection. I mean, a very simple thing. I was working with a lovely English company. They had a number of small warehouses, but they're now big enough they needed one proper national distribution centre. We said, okay, so this is going to do you for the next 20 years. It needs to be this size, this shape, these racks. It needs to be in the Golden Triangle, close to the railway lines. Today, the UK railway is coal-fired, but that will change, so make sure it's there. And secondly, because they wanted to build greenfield, where they check what orientation to put it in for solar panels. They didn't break even for the business case at the day of implementation, but if you orientate it in the right direction, depending on the sun there, as soon as they break even, you can fit it in. So it's that future fit look, not just what's on the statute books today. And not taking English politics as in any way a benchmark of the repeatability of regulations, but things will change. So you've got to have that longer term view.
Mike?
Yeah, I think when you're launching into new geographies, I think standardization, international standards for any kind of measurements really important. And also collaborating with NGOs, so local organisations in the areas that you're moving into, especially if it's a first move for your business into somewhere overseas. You're not going to have local experts, but there will be local experts available that you can lean on. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Mm-hmm. We need to go into the areas and find out the people that know what they're doing, know the local practices, know how we can work as a business in those local areas and work with them. And that comes back to that piece around collaboration. Don't go in there thinking that you know it all and you can do it all yourself. Open yourself up to working with others and working with best practices in those local areas. But I just wanted to touch on that piece that you mentioned earlier, saying if the measurement is very important. And you and I were talking about this earlier, Maureen, about the old adage of if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But we felt almost within sustainability that there's also a need to do something even if you can't measure it. We don't need to know exactly how much it's changing the dial by to know that it's changing the dial. Mm-hmm. And often it's really difficult to know, that the measurements that we use are inaccurate and have broad brush and estimations. And so to gain a couple of percentage, that could just be lost within the data. We don't know for sure that what we're doing has changed those dials. But when you look at some of the changes that could be made but aren't made because the data might not stack up, I think that's one of the problems that we've got. Action is more important than just sitting there looking at it, waiting for the data to tell us what to do.
Mm.
I think, done is better than perfect if you're kicking off these things.
Not letting perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
Particularly at board level, at times there is some procrastination going, well, we're not exactly sure what it'll give us.
Yeah.
We today don't have the data as clear as we'd like it on carbon to do that crystal clear business case you get for your physical investments.
Yeah.
But
it's worth having the tenacity to have those arguments as well,
yes.
Because you do get this sort of atrophy of progress if you wait for everything to be perfect.
Yeah.
But I just want to touch on your point about NGOs and local experts. They're also a great source of funding as well. So if you're moving into a new geography, they will know where you can get sources of funding to do certain things. So I'm always there. If there's a way of doing something for free, of course, that's amazing. And so if somebody can help you with your initiative in a country where you don't have an existing footprint, great source of information there.
What I wanted to just move on to next is actually looping back to something you mentioned early on, Maureen, about sustainability almost operating in a silo. Mm-hmm. As a separate organisation. It was only a few weeks ago we were here as an organisation doing our Sustainability Live event, which was almost looking at a lot of things from the opposite direction. It was some certain sustainability experts sort of looking into the wider part of the business. We're almost looking at this to a degree the other way round. How So there's the identification of these silos sometimes about a sustainability operation within a business being there, but not being fully integrated. What advice would any of you have of actually integrating the two and making it a fundamental part? Maureen, I'll start with you because it was a point you brought up. How do you actually ingrain it into the very fabric of the business?
So I think the first is accepting it is a core part. So, I started in supply chain 25 years ago. And every decision we made, we evaluated it to balance service cost cash, service cost cash. Now it's service cost cash sustainability. It's a core business measure. And if we look at the carbon in our supply chains, 30% of it is in the scope 3. It's procurement and supply chain that have their hands on the levers that will drive those changes. So it's about accountability. It is a core element of what we do. And it's about having some really adult business conversations about who are we as a firm and what do we stand for and what are we willing to invest to drive forward. So I'm working with a fantastic company at the moment. They're a huge brand. It's children's products. You all have their products in your home. They're very aware at the board level that their customers are the people who will feel the impact of climate change. And they're absolutely committed. It runs through everything they do. We're helping them with a huge piece of work around how they work and engage with their suppliers. And yes, it is going on the scorecards. And yes, they are willing to make investments. And they're now starting to have the difficult conversations. So through procurement, they've said, okay, for our ocean freight, we've found a way to use renewable fuel for the ocean freight. That costs money. So now they're having to have the internal conversation on to achieve this outcome will involve a trade-off here. Another obvious one is moving from trucks to intermodal. It helps with carbon, it increases your lead time, which drives your inventory. Again, an adult business conversation of trading off those variables and achieving what matters to you as a firm. So if it's not in that core business discussion priority setting, if it's a hobby, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, it's got to be absolutely ingrained. Mike, Phil, open that to you as well. Any advice or thoughts on that?
I think procurement people are used to having difficult conversations. It's what we're paid to do. And you can use those skills that you've got of negotiation to obviously negotiate internally to extract what it is that the business wants to achieve. It's possible the business might not want to achieve it. And if that's the case, then that's an outcome of sorts, and you work with that, and then one makes personal choices about it. But yeah, it's very important, especially in the world of Scope 3. Ours is a franchise business, as I mentioned. So Scope 3 is a lot. And if you're not talking to our owners about what their extended supply chains are like, and then you're not offering a value solution to them, which is either one that is kind of traditional supply chain and procurement value, or a sustainability value for those franchisees who are driven by that, and there are a lot that are driven by it, then yeah, that's really important. So yeah, I think it's grab the bull by the horns and have those challenging conversations. Very important, definitely.
Yeah. Mike?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a leadership challenge. A lot of this needs to come from the top, driving out, but the deliverables come from everybody within the business. It's a culture that needs to be developed in the same way that a low-cost culture or a lean manufacturing culture is developed. A sustainability culture is definitely something that needs to be ingrained within the business. It needs to be part of the values. It needs to be part of the everyday discussion. It needs to have time at the table around the executives. So it can't be something, as we've said, that can just be a little incentive on the side, or a side hobby, something that we like to do for PR. It has to be a bigger part of the business and really ingrained. And it has to have some weight when it comes to, as procurement professionals, we have the advantage that we can pull the right levers to pull the sustainability within our supply chain. But if you're not putting any weight in sustainability when it comes to any RFPs, then it's not going to really change anything within your supply chain. But if actually you're looking at not just the cost of the product in terms of cash, but in terms of its carbon, in terms of its waste, then that's when you can start influencing better practices and better decisions across the whole of the business. So I think it's a combination of a leadership challenge and a cultural challenge within the business.
I think it's a people challenge now as well. We've just gone through a recruitment exercise, and every single person who applied for those roles, especially the newer talent, required us to have a credible sustainability outlook. It was for a sustainability role, so fortunately, obviously, that helped. But it goes to show, I was talking to our Chief People Officer the other day, and I say, everybody is asking for it. So can you create some sort of employee value proposition around the sustainability element so that we can advertise and say that we are a responsible employer in that regard, and then we will attract the best of the talent.
Phil, I did just want to return to something you mentioned briefly before I move on to case studies, as you'll learn coming into this room over the next 2 days. I'm a fan of case studies and examples, so we'll come on to those in a second. But Phil, you were talking about working with franchisees.
Yes.
It's a different kind of relationship, isn't it, as opposed to having a fully employed network. What particular challenges are there? Is it harder to move people on from the, as you say, the I've got a mate who does this kind of thought process?
Yeah, it is. And it is quite geographical as well. So certain countries are very difficult to do a sort of global sourcing thing in. Turkey is one. You've got a huge import tax issue and a currency that struggles. India is another where you've got a huge import challenge to overcome. So really it has driven me to source in those countries, and actually with the pandemic and the supply chain issues that was causing, it was actually quite a good time to do that. So look at Turkey manufacturing for Europe, look at India manufacturing for Eurasia and the Middle East, rather than a reliance on Far Eastern sourcing. Going back to the original point about influence, yes, it's hard. And the way the hospitality industry is going, we're seeing franchise is becoming more and more popular rather than managed and asset ownership, because they obviously have completely different business models. So you have to find ways of adding value. And centralized procurement programs can be a very good source of added value, but you have to really design them from listening to those general managers and those owners of properties first. So say, give me some price, because everybody always says, oh, I got it cheaper. So okay, show me. What is it? Is it the same spec? Yada, yada, yada. And it's worth that horrendous pain at the very beginning to start doing all of this very detailed analysis and then be able to have that conversation, because you are then credible to the franchisee if you can show them that data. And you say, we've thought about this with you in mind, and this is why it can add value to you. So that's where procurement is a great source of added value. There will always be people who will always source from other sides. There will always be people who don't want to follow brand standards. That then becomes a different conversation that we have, whether or not you're appropriate for the brand or the flag. Yeah, different conversation, but yeah, can be challenging.
It can be challenging. Well, let's move on to some case studies and examples, because what I love about events like this is you've got a room full of incredibly experienced people listening to incredibly experienced people, all feeding off each other's experience and learning things. If you leave an event like this without taking something away from it, then frankly I haven't done my job right. So what I love is hearing these great examples that you will see in your day-to-day careers, whether it's within your own organisations, people you've worked with, people in your sector, where it's really excited you. You think this sustainable initiative, what a great idea. Why didn't we think of this? Or I really like the look of this. Which ones have really stood out for you in recent months or years that you'd flag up? And I'll open that up to all of you.
Just thinking time.
That's why I made it a long question. It gave you loads of thinking time.
Well, I'll throw out two while you guys think. One, and sorry, it's not very sexy, but it's very effective. Shadow carbon pricing. So one of our clients have absolutely built into their RFPs not just a percentage weighting, but they're literally giving a shadow carbon price, so that when the final options go for evaluation, that is being very, very clearly evaluated. So again, culture is important, intent is important, process matters. I know it's not sexy, people, but process is what translates the intention into actual action. So that one is quite good. The other is much more intentional use of tools like Coupa and Lamasoft and all of those things to actually model for carbon. Because the line we keep going back to in green logistics is take the miles out of your network and then take the carbon out of your miles. So before you start looking at the mode, have you done the network analysis to really minimize those miles and those distance, and then, which includes, full trucks, all of the obvious stuff, and then look to see what modalities can I use to drive the carbon out of those miles that I cannot remove.
You always tell when a particular line has landed when you see lots of pens moving in the room simultaneously. And it was take the miles out of your network.
Take the miles out of your network, and then take the carbon out of your miles.
Yeah, I'm just repeating that for anyone who got halfway through writing that. Any further ideas that you put forward? Good examples that you've seen.
I think certainly we were talking about IoT earlier whilst we were outside, the Internet of Things. Obviously, as Community Fibre, and we're an internet service provider, this isn't a pitch for the internet, but the availability of data and IoT being data in things that you wouldn't normally expect to see data, because it becomes a lot cheaper and easier to manage. So you're listening in for example, a fleet of vehicles being able to tell just through measuring the emissions, or measuring the temperature of the engine, or measuring the MPG, you've got a problem sooner rather than later. You're not having to wait until those annual services to see those problems and pick up on them. And when you scale that up into maybe a fleet of London buses, where they're measuring the vibrations on the rear axle, and they can pick up on problems within the engine much sooner than they used to be able to, because of the accessibility of data, all driven through IoT, all because they've been able to make things a lot cheaper and a lot more accessible. So I think as soon as we've got a load of data, there's a tendency to just collect as much as you can. But actually being able to tangibly do something with that data is really important. And sometimes you can be blinded, can't see the wood for the trees, to coin a phrase. And so making sure that the data that you're collecting is tangible, is useful, and then actually, as I said earlier, has some action from it. But I definitely think there's some exciting areas of innovation to come within IoT.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, data is absolutely key, and I'm thinking of two big franchisees we have in the UK, one with 31 properties and one with 18, both motorway service station operators. They have started to collect all of the utility data from their properties and understanding what it is that they're buying. Can the corporate offered procurement programs assist with that? Full trucks. Oh my God, so it's so simple. But to us, it's simple, but to somebody who doesn't think about procurement and supply chain and sustainability every day, maybe it's not as obvious as we assume it is. So being able to do that, and then starting to calculate measure and calculate CO2 footprint by measuring your utility consumption on a monthly basis at property level, it's fantastic. And they've both now expanded that out to their motorway service station areas, and they've actually got information now as to what is happening. So you can then start to drive management actions out the back of it and actually measure whether it's effective. So do we put an in-room control? But we can see what the impact is.
So that's such a good point. The thing about full trucks being obvious. To those of us who are warehouse nerds, it's obvious. And across the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've kept having arguments with the sales guys going, but why do you need a 4-hourly delivery? We just do. But now we can absolutely use the sustainability stick to drive actions that we have known are the correct actions for the last 10 years. Because now, rather than going back to the customer and saying, I'm reducing your service level, they can now go back to Tesco or whoever else and go, I'm going to reduce your scope 3. And the way I'm going to reduce your scope 3 is delivered to you on Tuesdays and Thursdays in full truckloads. So there's absolutely an opportunity to have a conversation with the suppliers, with the sales guys who have blocked this stuff for years, to say you are going to go back to the buyers and tell them this is how they'll reduce their scope 3, which is reducing my scope 1. So I would shamelessly use that stick. Because
it's true though. I
drives things forward.
Completely agree with you. And it's a good we're all supply chain geeks as well, so it's a good way to explain why it's important to have full trucks.
Exactly.
So we've got supply chain geeks, we've got warehouse nerds. It almost sounds like a range of mugs we could do for next year.
Are you calling us mugs, my friend?
Yeah, absolutely not. They'd be sustainable mugs. You could use them more than once. Moving back onto the data that you were talking about, Mike, a moment ago. Through my work on Procurement magazine, it feels like every other hour I get an email about this new technology solution, which is going to solve all the sustainability problems through a mixture of AI and magic, or I don't know. It seems to vary on a daily basis. How important is the use of technology and data analytics to really help the sustainability of the supply chain? Is it a vital part of the solution, or is it maybe overdone about the potential? Where do we feel that sits at the moment about the use of technology in finding sustainability opportunities in a supply chain?
I think it's critical. You can't. sorry, to say you can't is wrong, but to constantly be relying on Excels and very manual measurement is just not the way to do it anymore. You're going to turn people off who have to manually put data in, especially if you've got broad, disparate stakeholder groups. It's so easy now with AI or any kind of API feed to be able to take information from invoices or take it from consumption reports and plug that into a software that can then process information for you a lot quicker and visualize it a lot quicker rather than doing it all manually. So for me, it's absolutely essential.
Can I give you a yes, but? So
Perfect.
everything you said is correct. However, it's the leadership intent to act on that data. So the data can give you such clear insights, can point you in the right direction, can give you stuff that would have taken months to come up with.
Yeah.
But if there isn't leadership intent and you're not going to
It's
drive
pointless.
it forward and action it,
Yeah.
it's pointless. So it's the two. You were talking about before, you must have that tone from the top. You must have it in the GM scorecard. You must have leadership intent. You must have budget. And then once you've got all of those, you focus those laser-like to exactly what comes out through the tech.
Yeah.
But thinking that just buying the tech, no,
Oh,
that
yeah,
will give you
it-
the insight. Insight to action.
Absolutely.
what
Tech
matters.
isn't a solution in its own right. It
Yes.
has to have the strategy around it and the strategy around it.
Yes,
And the buy-in.
absolutely.
Otherwise, it's not going to be useful to anybody.
Well, otherwise, it's all the gear and no idea, isn't it?
I think
Exactly.
it's important to not forget, as we say, the people that are involved. And the data's great, and you can make some decisions, but sometimes you have a kind of an ivory tower opportunity to make a decision without recognizing the impact across, whether it's across your whole business or across certain parts of the business. So being out in person, boots on the ground, to help make those decisions shouldn't be ignored. A good example of that is recently we were trying to collect data on single-use plastic within our supply chain, and we were kind of struggling to get data from a number of our different suppliers, and we thought we'll just go to the warehouses, and we literally walked every single aisle, opened every box, took them out, took photos, took them apart, and said, these are the bits that we don't need anymore. And we had the CEO walking around with us making those decisions, so it was coming right from the top. But we could have spent months trying to collate that data.
How valuable was it having the CEO there in
Massively,
terms of
yeah.
getting buy-in from people?
Definitely, yeah. I think there's, it opens doors when you've got a CEO asking questions. It can, that everybody realizes that they've got some influence in the business, and CEOs out there should recognize, the power that they hold within the opportunity to make those decisions, and it's not somebody else that can make a decision. If the CEO says it happens, in most businesses, we find a way to make it happen. And so it's definitely important to have them there, but they're not there to just be there as a CEO. They're there to help make decisions and make influence as well, and kind of bring the whole team together. So it's not just them being on the team that makes a difference, it's the whole team around them. They can't do it on their own. We run a green team at Community Fibre headed up by the CEO, but there's huge numbers of people across the whole different parts of the business involved in the green team. There's guys from the procurement, the supply chain team, but there's also people from the network team, the technology team, sales guys. Anybody with an interest in the sustainability is getting involved, and it allows us to then break the work down into sizable, manageable chunks and really focus on making a change. So it's easier to sit there as a green team and have a meeting every month and discuss how great we are about doing things, but actually having the manpower and resources to go and make a change and the time to spend with the suppliers. Each person in the green team is allocated specifically to a supplier, so they don't need to be, yes, some of them have got the CEO allocated to them and they think they've done great. Others have got people from the sales team or an installation engineer, but they're going to make a difference as well. They're going to know exactly what's going on in the field that they can make a change over and dial that needle up small percentages at a time. We're not going to find one great big thing that's going to change everything, but when we add them all up, that's going to make the big difference.
Okay, there are more questions I'd like to go through, but the main feedback I always get from these events is we wanted more time for questions. So I'm making more time for questions. If there's any questions from the room, we will take them now. My stage manager, Tracy, has the mic. Do we have anything from the panel from the room immediately? There's any hands? If not, I will carry on. Oh, we do. Thank you. I was about to feel really stupid there after setting it up like that. Just at the back there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Just a quick question. You mentioned warehouses and the buildings in the supply chain. Are you seeing a change in how the owners of real estate and the businesses operating them are engaging in terms of how they talk to each other around the sort of sustainability supply chains?
Absolutely. I think actually Cushman & Wakefield might be here today. They're sort of the go-to people you ring if you're looking for a warehouse. And they've absolutely, speaking to them, seen a real shift in what people are looking for. So a modern, well-designed, low-carbon warehouse is very easy to shift at the moment. And if you've got an old, leaky, drafty building, they're really finding it hard to get tenants right now. So absolutely there's a focus in new build particularly, but there's a definite shift in the market. So yes.
Okay. Any
that
further?
lady there, I think, was...
Yep. Hidden in the
Hiya.
lights for me. Thank you.
Hopefully a quick one. So you spoke about including kind of scorecards and raising it on a business level of getting people involved in responsible business and sustainability. I think my question is, how do you get more procurement buy-in? I think that's something that we maybe not struggle with, but is still quite new with us. We don't have the tech and the AI in terms of getting those data analytics and having that view. So yeah, just a question around how we kind of open it up more to procurement.
I think you explained to procurement how valuable they are in this whole process, because the whole Scope 3 argument is one that procurement really can influence. The selection of suppliers, the selection of spec, or certainly the questioning of spec when the business comes to you and says we need it, is an absolute key way of doing it. And I think explaining that to procurement and saying this is how you can be really really influential in the change, that's one way of doing it.
I also think you need to then win the battle for hearts, but then for minds going, right, what are you scorecarded on? What are you bonused on? So if you tell your procurement team that their bonus is 100% tied to cost savings, I don't think it should surprise anyone if their focus is 100% on cost savings. So if it's a genuine imperative, because 20 years ago it was pure cost, and then it moved to cost of purchase, then it moved to cost of ownership, then it moved to the agility that came with the supplier and a more balanced scorecard. So sustainability needs to be one of the actual measures that they're tracked on, that their performance is measured on, that they're bonused on. So otherwise it's not real.
Yep.
Okay. Any further questions from the room? Just down here and then over there first.
Hi there. What do you think is going to be the global standard for measuring carbon? So I see there's like S1 and S2. There's science-based targets. There's things we're doing. Where do you think? Do you think there's going to get to one global measure, or where people actually recognise it?
Not soon enough to make a difference.
I agree. I always try and be hopeful in these things, but I don't think so. One of the issues we have in hospitality is just there is so many different ways of measuring it. There's so many different certifications. Last time I saw somebody had said there were over 1,000. So as a consumer, how on earth can you choose? So yeah, I don't think we'll get there anytime quickly.
Choose a decent proxy that you can calculate for the chain you've got and crack on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So don't get tied up on the measuring across everything. If we can, just make the difference. That's the important thing. And then other bits beyond carbon have been around for a lot longer that still haven't got fixed measurements. So it's quite a big leap to think that we're going to get to one standardization of measurement. But let's not get distracted by finding the perfect. Making the difference is more important than that.
Yeah, I could just feel the long-suffering vibe emerging from my right as that question came through. Next question was just over here in the blue, Tracy, if you could. Thank you.
Yeah, this is kind of tied into the gentleman on my right, which is Germany's brought in a supply chain act for people to conform to. When is the UK going to do anything legislative that people have to comply to?
Ooh. English politics.
Who wants to take that one first?
I'm no politician.
We're in a country on our 5th Prime Minister in
2 weeks, is it?
Yeah, I think so.
a very short period
Very
of time.
difficult question.
Yeah.
Well, I think in the same way that we, end users have to influence companies to change their policy by buying better, by buying greener. Everybody has a responsibility when they go to the voting booth to choose the politicians that align with their feelings. So if sustainability is important to you, then making sure that you're voting for pro-sustainable policies. So it's going to take a while until it's, we talked about it being it has to be important to the board to put sustainability on a KPI, it has to be bonused on it. until it becomes important to politicians, and what should be important to politicians is what's important to their voter base, that's when we're going to see that influence change, I think. So it's just making sure that we make the right decisions as individuals, and we try and influence those policies to be made in the right direction. Clearly, last couple of weeks, news coming out that we're kind of working backwards on our green agenda in the UK, and that's not a good thing for the long-term view. But it's just making sure that across the board we're making those right decisions and trying to influence the policy.
It's curious. It's not just the UK though. Sweden is going back. Germany is going back. I think it's a bigger problem as the cost of these things starts to bite. Making people's lives more expensive is a politically very difficult thing to touch, especially in the politics that we have now, which is very, very short-termist. So
I think business are going to lead rather than regulation on this one.
As always, isn't it? It's always the case. Innovation comes from businesses who care.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to have a very good answer to the question if I was used to interviewing very senior people in job interviews. And at the time, I used to say I've interviewed the last five prime ministers. And then that got really out of date really quickly, so I can't use that one anymore. We've got time for one more question from the room. If not, I will close things off on this panel. Are there any further hands? I think not. So I will just finish with one last question. And that is the balance between a procurement or supply chain operation having to balance price with sustainability in the wider business. What advice would you have to anyone who's battling with that? Well, it's something we just touched on there, isn't it? Battling with that balancing act.
For me, I think it's interesting because I'm coming from a world that is very heavily operations driven, but also with a big kind of operational cost running through it, assuming the asset cost is taken out of that equation. By using less, you're paying less. So from an energy perspective, we've found that the buy-in to the it's called the Wind and Green program, which is our sustainability program, has been the highest it's ever been globally because of the fact that energy costs have gone up so much. So being able to say, actually, this very short-term investment in those absolute basics like energy efficient lighting or in-room controls so that the room switches itself off when there's nobody in there, occupancy controls. That's the payback period for that is less than a year in some cases if you procure the kit properly and install it properly. So that has been a great driver for us because you should be able to reduce your operating costs through having an asset that's more sustainable. So that's where I go with that one.
Okay.
So that's the first leg. The second is deciding as a business what matters to you, and is this something you're going to invest in? And some of those are the obvious paybacks. Some of those are the longer term things. I'm building warehouse anyway, let's angle it for the solar panels. And some of those are like the company I spoke about that are making children's products. They have chosen to divert a really material amount of their revenue towards sustainability because they believe it's a core value for them and they'll drive that forward. And sometimes they get publicity for these things and sometimes they don't. Diageo, I think, were a great example. They've been well over 10 years really investing in sustainability across all measures, really focused on water. They've got a very good grain to glass program. But they grafted for a decade, I think, before they really got any publicity for it because they were determined they were not greenwashing. This was the right thing to do. And they did it.
And Mike, I'll give you the final word.
And it's definitely possible to still get a win-win situation from this. Just because it's more expensive doesn't mean it has less carbon, and just because it's cheaper doesn't mean it's worse for the environment. There's definitely opportunities to go for those win-wins. And I think we've touched on a number of these points today, that making sure that if you're focusing in the right area, you've got the right backing from your board to make the right decisions, then you can absolutely generate a lower cost. You don't need to sacrifice cost for sustainability or vice versa. And if you find yourself in a position where you're making a choice between two comparably cost products and one is more carbon efficient or one's worse for the environment, then making sure that you've got the board backing to make those right decisions, and the board are putting themselves in a position to allow everybody, and I say that culture of sustainability within the business. And also just making sure you're rethinking. If you find yourself in those situations where you haven't got a choice, you can get something that's less sustainable but costs a lot less, then you've got to probably go out there and look at it again and rethink it, look at it from a different frame, approach it from a different angle, because that absolutely should be a win-win situation for the business.
Okay. that is time on this panel. Thank you all for all of your questions on this one. And, well, big thank you to Mike, to Maureen, and to Phil. Round of applause, please.